The report arrived without a sender. That was the first thing archivist Senvale noticed. Not the contents, not the classification stamp, not even the fact that it had bypassed 3 layers of conclave authentication that should have been mathematically impossible to bypass. What she noticed first was the smell. The data crystal carrier had been scorched along one edge, and whatever process had burned it carried a chemical signature her olfactory implants couldn't identify. Not charred, not melted. Something had been removed from it deliberately, leaving behind only the faint molecular ghost of absence. She turned it over in her 3-fingered hand. The label read, Human Sector. Incident classification, none. Threat level, none. Recommended action? None. Every none had been stamped 4 times over. She plugged it in anyway. The Galactic Conclave had been tracking humanity for 63 of their years. In that time, 11 other species had been contacted, assessed, cataloged, and folded into the broader framework of civilized space. 3 of those species had required military intervention during first contact. 1 had required complete quarantine. The process was known, predictable, and above all, safe, because the Conclave was very good at reading the threat signatures of a young species before that species ever knew it was being read. Humanity had no threat signature. This was statistically impossible. Every sentient civilization produced a specific electromagnetic and gravitational footprint that encoded its fundamental nature, resource competition ratios, territorial expansion rates, interspecies conflict responses, neurochemical aggression markers. The Conclave's assessment models had been refined over 400 years and had never failed. They could look at a planet from 12 light-years away and tell you whether the dominant species would attempt diplomacy or warfare within 300 years of achieving space travel. For Earth, the models returned an error, not a prediction, not even an outlier result. An error. Something in humanity's profile caused the model to collapse inward on itself, producing numbers that contradicted each other at the foundational level. The Conclave's senior analyst had run the assessment 19 times, 19 errors. The 23rd analyst to review the results, a Drethari statistician named Almas, who had spent 40 years building threat models, had quietly requested early retirement after the 3rd attempt and never explained why. The official conclusion was a hardware fault. The unofficial conclusion was that nobody wanted to look at the numbers long enough to understand them. So the Conclave had done what bureaucracies do when they encounter something they cannot process. They assigned it a low priority, scheduled it for reassessment in 30 years, and moved on. What nobody had asked, what nobody had thought to ask for 63 years, was the question that Senvale found burned into the last page of the Scorched Crystals report in plain conclave text, as if someone had typed it and then realized immediately that they could never let anyone else see it. Why has no one attacked them? She read it 3 times. Because the question, once seen, became impossible to unsee. Humanity occupied a region of space that sat at the intersection of 4 different territorial expansion corridors. 3 pre-space civilizations on nearby worlds had gone extinct before humanity reached orbit. Gone extinct through means that the Conclave had quietly attributed to geological events, because the alternative explanation was something no one in the Conclave wanted to put in writing. The Keth Dominion had expanded aggressively in that region for 2 centuries. The Vral Collective had contested it. The Sheth Imperium had launched 17 military expeditions into nearby systems. Not one had touched Earth. Not one had even approached Earth. There were no records of attempted contact, attempted resource extraction, attempted territorial claim. No warning shots, no probe interceptions, nothing. 63 years of surveillance, and the only military incidents in the human home system were between humans themselves, which meant either every aggressive civilization in that region had independently decided humanity wasn't worth engaging, or something had stopped them. Senvale looked at the burned edge of the crystal. Something had removed part of this report before it reached her. She pulled up the transmission log. The crystal had originated from Survey Station Yeldera, assigned to the outer edge of the human observation perimeter. Standard station, standard crew, standard rotation cycle. Last check-in, 51 days ago. She checked the station's current status. The field read, operational. No anomalies reported. She cross-referenced with the automated beacon relay. The beacon hadn't pinged in 51 days. Her name was Lt Commander Reyes, Elena Reyes, and she had been awake for 31 hours when the alien probe first appeared on their long-range sensors. She didn't panic. That was the first thing her crew noticed. Not that she was calm exactly, but that she processed in a way that felt almost mechanical, her eyes moving across 3 screens simultaneously, while her right hand was already reaching for the encryption panel before she'd finished reading the initial data. Distance, she said. 14 AU and closing, said Specialist Ochoa. He was 23. He was trying very hard not to show that his hands were shaking. Velocity, 0.04 light, decelerating. So it wants us to see it coming. She said it as a statement, not a question. Flag it. Don't respond. Don't illuminate it with active sensors. You want to go dark. I want it to think we already are. Ochoa stared at her. Commander, if it doesn't know we see it, then we learn more from watching it than from announcing ourselves. She finally looked at him, and her expression was completely level. How long have we been running passive observation in that sector? 11 months. And in 11 months, has anything in that sector ever decelerated toward us? A pause. No. So something changed. Something decided we were worth a closer look. She turned back to the screens. I want to know why, before it knows we're asking. This was the ISV Patience, a human deep observation vessel, and its name was not accidental. It had been stationed at the edge of the solar system's heliopause for 3 years, running a mission whose official parameters were so classified that most of the crew had been told only that they were conducting long-range astronomical observation. Which was true in the same way that saying a surgeon is handling sharp objects is technically accurate. What Elena Reyes actually knew, and what she had not shared with her crew, because the weight of it was heavy enough for one person, was that the Patience had been positioned there specifically because Earth had been tracking something. Not the probe, not that specific probe, something else. Something that had been circling human space for decades in patterns that suggested neither random movement nor direct approach, but a third category of behavior that humanity's most experienced xenolinguists and strategic analysts had spent 4 years trying to name. They'd settled on assessment. Whatever was out there had been assessing them, watching, taking readings, running their own models. And Earth's highest clearance analysts had concluded 18 months ago that the assessment was coming to an end. The probe decelerating toward them was not first contact. It was the result of a decision that had already been made. The question was what the decision was. Senvale had not slept in 2 days, which for her species was not unusual. Valekin could sustain cognitive function for 6 standard days without sleep degradation. But the particular texture of her exhaustion felt different from mere duration. It felt like the exhaustion of standing at a cliff edge and looking down for so long that the height stops registering, and you begin, for a moment that terrifies you, to simply wonder. She had pulled every record she could access on the Human Observation Program. She'd found 19 separate assessment reports, each filed by a different analyst, each containing the same fundamental conclusion, phrased in 19 different ways. Humanity poses no measurable threat. And she'd found something else. Something small, the kind of detail that vanishes when you're looking at the large picture and only surfaces when you look at the edges. The dates. Every analyst who had worked on the Human Assessment Program and then transferred or retired, there were 31 of them, had transferred within 6 months of beginning review. Not all of them, but enough. Enough that the pattern was visible once you were looking for it, like a word that hides in static until someone says its name. Analyst transfers could mean anything: promotions, personal circumstances, standard rotation. But 2 of the 31 hadn't transferred. They had died. Both listed cause of death as natural. Both were species with lifespans that made natural death at their ages statistically equivalent to a human dying at 32. She was still staring at this when her communication panel opened, unprompted, and a voice she didn't recognize said, "Archivist Senvale, please stop accessing those files." Her hand froze. "Who is this?" A pause. Her hand froze. "Who is this?" Not the pause of someone searching for words, the pause of someone deciding how much to give away. Someone who has been watching the human file longer than you have, long enough to know what you're about to find. And what am I about to find? Another pause. Longer. "The reason no one attacks them," the voice said, "is not what you think it is. It's not strength. It's not a deterrent. It's not a treaty or a mutual defense arrangement or a cosmic accident of geography." The voice dropped slightly as if the speaker had leaned closer to something. "It's a question, Archivist. A question that every civilization capable of reaching them eventually asks themselves, and the answer to that question is the most frightening thing in surveyed space." The channel closed. Senvale sat in the silence of her office for a long time, and she thought about the burned edge of the data crystal, and about the dead analysts, and about the error that 19 simulations had returned, and about the question someone had typed and then tried to erase. And she realized that she was afraid in a way she couldn't fully articulate, not because she was in danger, but because she could feel, with the particular clarity that comes from looking at enough pieces of an incomplete picture, that she was about to understand something that she would spend the rest of Hibmet. She opened the remaining files. The probe matched velocity with the patience at 4AU. Elena had expected some kind of communication attempt. Every first contact simulation she'd run during her 2 years of mission preparation had modeled communication as the first move. Radio signals, mathematical sequences, light patterns, gravitational pulses. The probe did none of these things. It simply stopped 4AU out and waited. "It's just sitting there," Ochoa said. "I know. That's a long way to come just to sit." "It's not sitting, it's watching." She pulled up the passive sensor array. "It's measuring us, seeing how we respond to being watched. How should we respond?" She considered this for a moment. "The same way we've been responding for 11 months, like we don't know it's there." Ochoa turned in his chair to look at her directly. "Commander, it stopped 4AU from us. That's not a coincidence. It knows where we are." "Yes," she said, "and it wants to know if we know it knows." The silence that followed had a specific quality, the kind that comes when someone says something that takes a moment to fully unpack, and in the unpacking reveals that the situation is stranger than you thought. "This is a test," Ochoa said slowly. "Most things are," Elena said. She almost smiled. "The question is whether we're the ones being tested, or whether we're the ones walking the test happen to something else." Ochoa stared at her for a long time. "I don't understand what that means." She turned back to her screen. "Neither did I the first time someone explained it to me. Give it time." What she didn't tell him, what she couldn't tell him, because some knowledge changes the way a person moves through space, and she needed him functional, was that the Patience was not the only human vessel in this region. The 3 years she'd spent ostensibly alone at the heliopause, with a crew of 12, running passive observation, that had been the visible part, the deliberate, readable part. The thing that would show up on alien sensors as a small, vulnerable, obviously human vessel doing something that looked like science, the other part was not visible. She'd never seen it herself. She'd only been told it was there 3 days before departure by a woman in a gray coat who had no name on her badge and who had looked at Elena for a long time before saying, "If something comes, don't try to protect yourself. Just do what you planned. We'll be watching what they do." Elena had asked, "What if what they do is attack us?" The woman had said, "They won't." Elena had asked, "How do you know?" And the woman had looked at her with an expression that wasn't confidence exactly. It was something older, something that had been refined over decades into a shape that could pass for confidence if you didn't look at it too closely. "Because," she'd said, "we've spent 30 years making sure they can't afford to." Ha 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 ha! This was the part of the file Senvale had reached when she stopped breathing for a moment. The file was not a conclave file. She understood that now. It was a human file, a human intelligence document that had, somehow, found its way into conclave data infrastructure through a channel that should not have existed. The burned edge of the crystal wasn't damage, it was redaction. Someone had removed everything that could identify where this document had come from, but had left the contents intact. The question was whether that was an accident or a message. She kept reading. The document was, at its surface level, a strategic overview. 31 years of accumulated human intelligence on conclave-adjacent civilizations. She skimmed it and felt something cold crystallizing in her processing. The level of detail was extraordinary. Not just system maps and fleet configurations. Those could be gathered passively. This contained decision-making analysis, diplomatic communication intercepts, internal military planning documents, the private reasoning of 17 different heads of state across 9 different civilizations, detailing exactly what they had considered when evaluating the human sector and why they had ultimately decided against action. 17 different civilizations, 17 different decision-making processes, 17 different conclusions, phrased differently, arrived at through different strategic calculus, reflecting different cultural values and different threat tolerances, all reaching the same answer. Don't? And buried in the center of the document, surrounded by so much dense analysis that it would be easy to miss, was a list. 43 items. Each item was a specific action that had been attributed to geological events, accidents, equipment failures, political implosions, resource miscalculations, or simple misfortune. 43 incidents across 11 civilizations over 31 years. Each one had a note attached. 3 words. Human. Confirmed. Origin. Senvale read the list 3 times. She was very good at pattern recognition. It was literally the function her implants had been optimized for, and within the first pass, she could see the shape of it clearly. The incidents were not random. They were not punitive. They were not designed to demonstrate strength or send a message in any conventional military sense. They were preventive. Every single one of them, every political implosion, every military expedition that had turned back for mysterious reasons, every admiral who had died of natural causes at age 32 had occurred just before an action that would have brought that civilization into contact with human space. Not after an attack, before a decision. Humanity was not responding to threats. Humanity was weeding the decision trees of other civilizations in real time, identifying the nodes where a choice would be made that led toward conflict, and quietly, surgically, deniably removing those nodes before the choice could be executed. For 31 years, without anyone noticing. Without anyone even suspecting, because the removal was so clean, so embedded in plausible alternative explanations, that even civilizations with sophisticated counterintelligence infrastructure had attributed every incident to everything except its actual cause. She sat with this for a long time. Then she understood why the threat model returned an error. The model was looking for a civilization that would respond to threats. Humanity didn't respond to threats. Humanity made threats stop existing before they became threats. There was no threat signature because the methodology was invisible. because it had to be invisible to work. And it worked because humans had understood, at some foundational level, something that no other civilization in surveyed space had understood, that you don't need to be stronger than your enemies. You need your enemies to never fully form. The communication panel opened again. "You understand now," said the voice. It wasn't a question. "The list," Senvale said, and her voice was steadier than she felt. 43 incidents. You're telling me those are just the ones that made it into a document they allowed to reach us?" A long silence. "Yes," said the voice. "How many total? We don't know. We've been counting for 11 years, and we don't have a reliable lower bound." A pause. "We have a reliable upper bound." Her stomach, metaphorically speaking, fell. "What is it?" "We stopped counting when the numbers stopped being useful as information," the voice said. "When a number is large enough that knowing it precisely doesn't change what you do with it." Lt Reyes was eating cold coffee and a protein bar she didn't taste when the probe moved, not toward them, away. A 5-second burn, a minor course correction, a new vector that she pulled it up immediately would take it past the heliopause and back into deep space on a trajectory that didn't align with any system in their charts. "It's leaving?" Ochoa said. "It's sending a report," Elena said. "How do you know?" "Because it had everything it came for." She set down the protein bar. "It came to see how we'd react to being watched. We gave it exactly what we planned to give it. Now it's going to report back, and something somewhere is going to look at its data and make a decision." "What decision?" She looked at him, and for the first time in 31 hours, she let something show on her face that wasn't the particular practice stillness of command. It was something smaller and more human. Something that might have been called worry if it hadn't coexisted with something that was very close to satisfaction. "Whether we're something to be afraid of," she said. "Are we?" She was quiet for a moment. Outside, through 3 feet of hull and 4 AU of vacuum, the probe was already building speed, carrying whatever it had learned back to whoever had sent it. "We were afraid," she said finally, "for a very long time. We were a small species on one planet, and we could see, once we knew how to look, exactly what was out there and exactly how many of them had looked at us and run the numbers. And we understood. The people who did the math first, who had to carry that knowledge before anyone else was ready to hear it, we understood that we had a choice. Get stronger, get allies, or make sure that getting stronger wasn't necessary." Ochoa was very still. "What does that mean?" "It means," she said, and picked up the protein bar again, "that strength is expensive. Visibility is expensive. Being the species that everyone's watching because you're dangerous is a full-time occupation, and it uses resources you can't spend on anything else." She took a bite. She didn't taste. "We chose the other thing." "What other thing?" She looked at him over the protein bar, and her expression was very calm. "We chose to be the species that everyone forgets to watch," she said, "because nothing interesting ever seems to happen around us." The document had a second section. Senvale had almost missed it. It was embedded in what appeared to be corrupted data at the end of the file. Random character strings, the kind of garbage output that appears when a transmission is degraded. She'd been about to close the file when her pattern recognition implant had flagged something in the noise, a structure buried in the static, hidden not with encryption, but with the far more sophisticated method of hiding inside the visual expectation of meaninglessness. She extracted it, decoded it, read it. It was 23 lines. It contained 11 names. Every name on the list was an active conclave analyst, senior tier. 3 were on the Council of Assessment itself. The notes beside each name were brief enough that she read them twice each to be certain she understood what she was reading, because the implications refused to settle into any shape she recognized as sane. The notes described, for each analyst, a specific decision that they had made within the last 2 years, a budget allocation, a priority reassessment, a recommendation that had resulted in a particular program being defunded or delayed or restructured. Ordinary bureaucratic decisions, the kind made hundreds of times per day across the conclave's administrative infrastructure. Except that each decision, looked at in sequence from the first to the last, told a story about a particular program, a program that had been running for 9 years, a program whose full designation she found in the final 3 lines of the document, in text that was somehow simultaneously the most official and most alarming thing she'd ever read. Project Lantern. Status: defunded. Budget cycle 31. Purpose: real-time surveillance monitoring of human sector intelligence activity. Reason for defunding: assessed as low priority. Threat model: no actionable data. Analyst recommendation chain: 11 names listed above. The monitoring program that would have caught what humanity was doing. Defunded by 11 analysts whose decisions individually had looked completely reasonable, whose decisions collectively had removed the only thing that could have seen. She looked at the list of names again. 11 conclave analysts, different species, different departments, different seniority levels. No obvious connection between them, except that each of them, at some point in the last 4 years, had briefly been assigned to the human observation file. Brief assignments, days in some cases. The kind of incidental exposure that generates a record in the system but doesn't typically warrant attention. She was trying to articulate the thought that was forming, the thought that had a shape too large for the language she was reaching for, when the voice returned. "Say it," the voice said. "They didn't retire the program," Sinvale said carefully. "They didn't need to. They just made sure the right people were in the right positions to make the right decisions." A pause. The analysts who defunded it weren't compromised. They just made the rational choice with the information available to them, the voice said. Information that had been arranged. Information that had been available, the voice said, and there was something in the distinction that felt very deliberate. Every piece of data those analysts used was real. Every analysis was sound. The budget modeling was accurate. The threat assessment was legitimate. By every measure, the correct decision was to defund it. A long pause. The arrangement wasn't the data. The arrangement was which data existed to be seen. Sinvale was very quiet for a moment. "How long," she said finally, "has humanity been operating inside conclave administrative infrastructure?" The pause before the answer was the longest one yet. "We don't know," said the voice. "And I've been investigating this for 11 years. The probe was gone. The Patience continued its slow drift at the heliopause, and Elena Reyes hadn't slept in 37 hours, and Ochoa had finally stopped asking questions because he could see she was in a place where questions wouldn't reach her. She was thinking about the woman in the gray coat. "We spent 30 years making sure they can't afford to." She was thinking about what that sentence actually cost, not strategically, personally. How many people? How many years of quiet service in corridors that didn't officially exist, making decisions that couldn't be explained to anyone, carrying knowledge that changed the texture of every ordinary moment, every morning, every meal, every conversation with someone who didn't know, because you were one of the people who knew that the sky wasn't safe and that the only reason it looked safe was because of work that could never be acknowledged and wouldn't be mourned if it failed, and would be invisible if it succeeded. The cost of the invisible thing was invisibility. That was the part that didn't make it into strategic documents. You couldn't model it. You couldn't put a number on it. It was the thing that the people doing the work carried inside them, alone, because the nature of the work was that you couldn't put it down and you couldn't share it, and you couldn't point at it when the weight got too heavy and say, "Look at the thing I'm carrying. Look at what it cost to make the sky safe for people who don't know the sky was dangerous." The protein bar sat half-eaten on the console. Somewhere out there, the probe was carrying its data home. Somewhere out there, the thing the woman in the gray coat had built, the thing that hundreds of people before Elena and hundreds of people parallel to her had spent decades constructing inside the negative space of other civilizations' blind spots, was still running, still adjusting, still reading the decision trees and finding the nodes, still making threats stop existing before they became threats. She looked at Ochoa. He was young and he was tired, and he was sitting with the specific discomfort of someone who has understood that the world is larger and stranger than they were prepared for, but hasn't yet understood that the strangeness is livable. "Try to sleep," she said. "Can't," he said. "Thinking." "What about?" He was quiet for a moment. All the things that almost happened. All the things that didn't happen because... He stopped, started again. "We had a professor at Academy. Used to say that the most important events in history are the ones that didn't occur. Wars that didn't start, diseases that didn't spread. He meant it as a lesson about contingency, about how fragile everything is." Ochoa looked at his hands. I don't think he knew he was describing something operational. Elena looked at him for a long time. "He might have," she said. Senvale requested an emergency session with the Council of Assessment at the 11th hour of her second sleepless day. She was denied on procedural grounds. She requested it again. Denied. She went to the office of the council's senior administrator, a Keth named Vorthson, who had 40 years of institutional memory and a reputation for caring deeply about exactly one thing, the correct functioning of conclave bureaucracy, and she put the document on his desk. He read it in silence. He read it again. "This is a forgery," he said. "I verified every data stamp," she said. "The origin metadata is corrupted, but the embedded timestamps on the analytical sections are authentic conclave infrastructure. This document was generated inside our systems. Then it was planted by a hostile actor to destabilize Vorath." She rarely used names without titles. The effect was immediate. He stopped. "The 11 analysts. Pull their decision records. Don't run a model. Pull the actual records and read them in sequence, in the order I've listed them." She tapped the document. "Tell me what you see." He looked at her for a long time. He pulled up the records. She watched him read. She watched his expression in the way you watch a landscape when weather is changing, not looking for specific features but reading the overall shift, the gradual change in light and texture that tells you something large is coming. He read for 40 minutes. At the end, he closed the files. He placed both hands flat on his desk. He looked at a point above her head and to the left for a long moment that felt like more than a pause and less than a decision. "Who else has seen this?" he said. "The person who sent it to me. And now you, the person who sent it. I don't know who they are, but they have access to conclave infrastructure." She waited. He looked at her directly. "How long have they had access?" "I asked that question," she said. The answer was not reassuring. He was quiet for a very long time. "The question," he finally said slowly, "that this document is designed to make us ask. The question about the attacks, about why no one has attacked them." He stopped. "It's not the right question, is it?" She shook her head slowly. "The right question," he said, and his voice had taken on the quality of someone reciting something they're still processing, still trying to believe, "is how long they've been attacking us." He stopped. "Not with weapons. Not with anything that looks like an attack." "But yes," she said. "And the Project Lantern analysts. The defunding. If we reinstate the program, we'll be looking for evidence of something that's had 11 years of additional time to become invisible since the program went dark," she said. "We will find some things. We will think we've found most things. We will be wrong." She let that sit. "That's not the threatening part." He looked at her very carefully. "What is?" The threatening part, she said, is that they let us find the document. She touched the burned edge of the crystal. This reached me because someone wanted it to reach me. The burned sections weren't damaged. They were curated. They left exactly enough to understand, not enough to act effectively. She looked at him. They're not hiding from us anymore. They're showing us a controlled piece of what they are, because they've decided we're at the point in our assessment of them where they want us to know, where it serves their purposes for us to know. A pause, and we still can't do anything about it. The silence in the room had changed. It had become a different kind of silence. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of too many things at once, all of them arriving at the same moment. Why? Vorathsun said. His voice was very quiet. Why would they want us to know? Because, Sendel said, knowing and being unable to act on the knowledge is a very specific kind of message. It says, we are aware that you know. We are aware that you cannot change it. We are not threatening you. We are informing you that this is simply the situation and has been for longer than you realize, and you are safe as long as you remain the kind of civilization that has no urgent reason to engage with us. She paused. It's not a threat. It's a contract, and the terms have been set. By them. By them, she agreed. Before we knew there were terms to set, Vorathsun sat back in his chair. He was a bureaucrat. A good one, a careful one, someone who had spent 40 years ensuring that processes were followed and records were maintained and the machinery of civilization moved in orderly and predictable ways. He looked in this moment like a man who has opened a drawer expecting to find a document and found instead that the drawer had no bottom. The conclave, he said carefully, has 400 years of institutional experience in evaluating species, in determining threat levels, in deciding what kind of civilization a young species will become. He paused. And you're telling me that there is currently a species, younger than our most junior assessment cycle, that has been operating inside our infrastructure, shaping our decisions, managing our conclusions? Yes. Without our knowledge, yes. For an unknown period of time, potentially longer than we've been formally observing them, yes. And has now chosen, deliberately, to let us see enough to understand what they are, but not enough to effectively respond, yes. He looked at her. Why aren't we afraid? It was, somehow, the most honest question anyone had asked since the crystal arrived, and she answered it honestly. We are, she said. We're just processing it slowly, because it doesn't feel like what fear is supposed to feel like. There's no weapon, there's no fleet, there's nothing to point at. She looked at the document. That's the thing about humans. They made themselves safe by making the danger impossible to see, which means the fear comes without a target. It just comes. She thought about the burned edge, about the timing, about the carefully curated revelation, and I think, she said, very quietly, that they knew that would be worse. Lt Reyes slept for 4 hours finally and dreamed about nothing she could remember. She woke to Ochoa saying her name from a careful distance, the way you wake someone when you're not sure what mood they'll surface into. New signal, he said. She was upright before she was fully awake. The probe? No, different vector, much closer. He was looking at his screen with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not fear exactly. Something that was working very hard to process itself into something else. It's not alien. She crossed to his station, looked at the data. A signal, 2AU out. Tight beam, encrypted, using a key she recognized. A key that didn't officially exist, that wasn't in any manual, that she'd been given verbally and told to memorize and never write down. She decoded it. Read it. 4 words. Assessment complete. They know. She read it again. Stood very still for a moment. Felt something move through her that wasn't quite relief, and wasn't quite dread but occupied the same territory. What does it say? Ochoa asked. She thought about the woman in the gray coat, about 30 years of invisible architecture, about 43 incidents that were never traced, and however many more that were never counted, and the 11 analysts who had made the correct rational decision with the information available to them. About the question no one had asked for 63 years, and what happened when someone finally did. It says, she told him, that the next part starts now. He looked at her. Young, tired, carrying something he hadn't been carrying 2 days ago. What's the next part? She folded the decoded message and held it for a moment. The part, she said, where they have to decide what we are. She looked out at the dark. We already know what they're going to decide, she said quietly. We've been making sure of it for 30 years. She didn't say the rest. Didn't say, and they're going to be right, and they're going to be afraid, and the fear is going to be exactly calibrated, and none of it is going to look like what it is, because that's the whole point. That's been the whole point. That's been the whole point since the beginning, that the thing that keeps us safe looks from every angle like nothing at all. She didn't say it because Ochoa would have asked how you live with that. How you spend your life building something invisible, pouring yourself into a structure no one can see, paying the cost of the quiet thing, carrying the weight of the sky because of work that cannot be named. And the honest answer was that you lived with it the way humans lived with most things. One day at a time. One decision at a time. One small, surgical, invisible intervention at a time, in the belief that the accumulation of small invisible things adds up to something worth the cost of the invisibility. In the belief that the sky is worth keeping safe, even for people who don't know it was ever dangerous, especially for them. In the Conclave archives, in a file that was no longer classified as low priority, archivist Senvale wrote her final notation on the human assessment record. She wrote it carefully because she understood the documents have audiences, and some audiences are the ones you intend and some are not, and she was no longer certain which category applied to anything she wrote. She wrote, "Humanity does not protect itself by being strong. It protects itself by being the species that every other civilization, upon full consideration, decides is not worth the cost of engagement. This outcome is not accidental. It is not a function of geography or resource poverty or technological limitation. It is a constructed condition maintained actively at significant human cost by methods that remain only partially visible to conclave analysis." She paused. Added, the assessment model returned an error because the model was built to evaluate civilizations that respond to threats. Humanity does not respond to threats. Humanity ensures, through means we are still mapping, that the threshold for threat formation is never reached. This is not a passive posture. It is the most aggressive form of strategic patience observed in 400 years of conclave history. She paused again, looked at the burned edge of the crystal, thought about the 11 names and the contract, whose terms she had not been party to setting, and the 400 years of conclave history, and what it meant to be the institution that evaluated civilizations, and to encounter, for the first time, a civilization that had apparently been evaluating it back. She wrote the last line. Recommended action, none. Then she sat for a long time in the quiet of her office, and outside the conclave's great administrative structures turned slowly in the dark, processing and filing and modeling and assessing in the orderly, predictable, carefully maintained ways of 4 centuries, and somewhere in the vast and layered machinery of that institution, in decisions not yet made and information not yet arranged to be visible, the architecture continued its quiet work. Nobody noticed. That was the point that had always been the point.